You know, our Prime Minister in Canada has just decided to do the same thing to Canadian farmers that the Netherlands has done to the Dutch farmers. He's going to force them, because he likes to use force, because he's saving the planet, even though he's not. He's going to force them to reduce their nitrous oxide output. And here, get this, man, this is something. He decided that he's going to do that without calculating the ratio of pollution produced to food produced. And so the provinces and the farmers are pushing back and saying, well, how about you judge our polluting use on the basis of how much food we produce? Wouldn't that be like vaguely reasonable? And the answer from the feds has been, no, we want an absolute reduction. And that's exactly an example of this low resolution, narcissistic moralism that is substituting both for genuine religious conviction and for genuine knowledge. And I would say our Prime Minister in Canada, he is, if it isn't Jacinda Ardern and Kamala Harris, it's definitely Justin Trudeau, who are the poster people for this sort of thinking.
Very briefly, it's a great example of how economists would approach this conversation. It's basically saying, look, there's something nice about this idea of reducing nitrogen deposits. It actually, especially biologists, but also other people like the fact that there are low fertilizer areas, where different kinds of sparse plantations live, and that can be a nice sort of ecosystem. But if you ask most people, how much are you willing to pay for that? So, the other set is we can't produce as much food. We can't keep our culture. A lot of farmers are going to go bankrupt. And of course, also that you're just going to move this nitrogen deposit to, for instance, developing countries instead.
Right, exactly.
Then you have to ask, so what's the weighing of these two things? We do that all the time. And let me just give you this one obvious consequence.
That's called thinking.
When you talk about the speed limit, most people, if you don't, so in the U.S. about 40,000 people die on the roads every year, mostly because people drive too fast. And the simple question is, well, shouldn't you do something about it? If you don't reflect very much, people will just say, yeah, that number should be 0. Well, there's a very obvious way to get it to 0. It is to put the speed limit at 5 kilometers or 3 miles an hour. Now, nobody would get killed, but nobody would get anywhere either. So that's, of course, why we don't actually do it. Every year and every day we decide, all of us, yes, I would like to go at a reasonable speed, and that will end up meaning some people will die. There's a trade-off here. Now, we can have a sensible conversation. Do we want to have, do we use 55 miles or, 85 miles? And that's a fine conversation, but nobody suggests it should be 0 or 3 miles an hour. And that's the conversation that we need to have in all these other things. So when we're talking about nitrogen deposit, of course, we all want to have less rather than more, but we also have lots of other things we want to do. We need to recognize those
like
trade-offs.
eat. So when I had calculated, and this is a rough calculation, and I knew it was wrong, I figured that we'd be facing a world in the fall and the winter where 150 million people would be starving. But Michael Yon mentioned that it was going to be 1.2 billion. That was his estimate. And I thought, oh my God, not only is that famine on a level that we haven't seen probably since the early 60s, and then he talked about how famine multiplies, because once a famine hits, the governments tend to take centralized control over food production and basically appropriate farmers' crops, and then the farmers quit growing crops, which is exactly what you'd expect. So not only do you have 1 billion, you have the stage set for an expansion of famine. And then I thought, well, what happens when 1.2 billion people go hungry? And that's going to be, in the poorest countries throughout the countries that are most likely as well to push desperate immigrants towards Europe's borders, and the same on the American front. And so not in the fall, you tell me again if I'm wrong, if you are right and Jan is right, not only are we going to see a seventh of the world go hungry in a serious way, like it's already happening in Sri Lanka, but we're going to see immigration pressure, movement pressure on the flanks of Europe and the United States on a scale that maybe we've never seen. And how sure are you that that's what we're looking at in the fall and winter?
So I think there's a couple of things. First of all, we're starting out in a world where there's already some 700 or 800 million people that are starving. And this has fairly little to do with the current energy crisis or fertilizer crisis, but it's just the fact of people being poor. So again, that goes to your general point of saying, look, maybe we should get people out of poverty first. But the second part of this is, it actually turns out that when people are really, really poor and really damaged in many ways, for instance, through starvation, they will not flee because they can't. So I'm not sure that we're going to see huge immigration streams. We might, and I think it's useful to start thinking about, but I don't have the data on whether. So it's actually, you see more refugee streams when people get richer, because then they can start afford to get, on trucks or buses or even flights and go to Europe and the US. But if you're really poor, you're just, stuck. This is more of a moral problem than I think it's going to be at first a political problem. But I think fundamentally, this is about our priorities, and it's about saying, what kind of moral person do you want? Do you want to be the moral person that said, I want to save the world from climate change, so I'm going to make sure we don't use gas to make fertilizer that could save millions of people? Or are you actually going to be a person who says, no, I actually think saving people's lives is a little more important?
Isn't it even almost worse, right? Because I think in many instances, particularly in Africa, right? I mean, it was European policies, particular, who hampered and in some cases really sabotaged their ability to feed themselves, right? By not allowing them access to energy. I mean, if you look at, for example, global maps about electricity supplies, there is a huge gap in most of Africa, which also has the highest number of birth rates. So the population that's growing fastest is the one with the most limited access to energy. And as you know, right, whether it's high temperatures or low temperatures or whether food production, energy is key. And I think in many ways, it was kind of deliberate policies, or kind of the idea that you can all of a sudden run, I don't know, the Democratic Republic of Congo or these areas, that you can run them on wind and solar. So it seems that it's not just that we don't help them to get rich. If somebody would be a cynic, but I think it's true. In some cases, we kept them poor, particularly when it came to energy and food production.
I think you're absolutely right. First of all, remember, this is a European crisis. That's why we're talking about it. If it was a crisis in Africa, almost nobody would care, right? The second part of this is that the reason why Africa and many other places are poor is not just because of this crisis that we're seeing right now. It's much, much broader. I made the comparison last year that all of the energy in Uganda, which is a bigger nation than California is, they're like 43 million versus 39 million. All of the electricity in Uganda is less than the electricity Californians use to heat their pools.
I also read, Bjorn, that Uganda is fertile enough so that if it was properly harnessed, it could feed all of Africa. And that they have a water supply that's very close to the surface in most of the country, and that it would be a relatively simple matter to sink pumps all over the country to get enough water to produce the place fertile enough to feed the entire continent. That's just Uganda.